and welcome to The Weight of Freight, where we explore the intricate yet powerful connections between the commodities and shipping markets. And this episode will also feature on the Crude Report podcast series. So, Trump 2.0 is now upon us, and oh boy, is it shaping out to be an exciting ride for the global commodities trade. And for today, we will focus on what Trump's new term in office may mean specifically for the crude market and tanker freight. And my name is Alex Yunovich. I'm the global head of freight at Argus Media, and I'm joined by a bunch of my smart colleagues here today, which is Nick Watt, editorial manager for freight, James Guda, VP for crude in EMEA, Bruce Fullen, VP for crude in the US, and Jeff Kralowitz, who's the VP for crude looking after Canada. And we're recording this podcast on January 14th. So, gents, thank all of you for being here. And the Trump topic that we're tackling here is huge. So we're going to narrow it down and in this episode focus on the tariffs which Trump promised to enact from his first day in office on January 20. So let's start with Canada here. What would a 25% tariff, if it were to happen, mean for Canadian exporters and the US refiners? Jeff?
Well, thanks, Alex. I think it would mean two things. One, pretty dramatic trade flow changes, specifically around the west coast of the U.S. And secondly, big impacts on gasoline, diesel, jet fuel prices in the mid-continent of the U.S. And just to unpack that a little bit, on the west coast, we've got over 150,000 barrels a day of new crude leaving Vancouver by ship going to California coast. That would likely all be diverted to Asia if the price to the Californians went up by 25%. So that would have some significant issues for freight. And then looking at PADD 2, which is the mid-continent, the section of the US around Chicago, a couple things. The Canadians might well try to discount their sales to PADD 2 a little bit to take the sting out of the tariff. But in almost any scenario, you would see the PADD 2 refiners cutting their runs and the price of gasoline and distillate rising pretty dramatically.
Okay. And if we're talking here about the TMX and Vancouver exports and them being diverted to Asia, as you, Jeff, said, might have a considerable impact on the trade flow, but therefore also the transportation costs and shipping comes into the play here. So, Nick, right now we have the situation where it's about half and half. So half of what TMX produces and goes into the spot market goes to the West Coast or to PAL, and about half goes to Asia. Do you agree with Jeff? Are we likely to see that there's going to be just full-on flow to Asia, and what that would mean for just the freight rates around the region?
I do. Yeah, I think it would likely mean most, if not all of those cargoes that had been, that are right now going to the U.S. West Coast would be going to Asia, primarily China, possibly a little bit to India and a few other countries. And right now it's about an average of a little over 20 Aframaxes per month that load crude in Vancouver. Aframax, that's the largest type of vessel that export terminal there can accommodate. And what you would see is more of these long haul journeys across the Pacific instead of these shorter voyages to the U.S. West Coast. And what that does to the freight market is it stretches the fleet. It puts a little bit of upward pressure on rates. Now, mind you, right now, freight rates are pretty low. They've been flirting with multi-year lows. They got a little bit of a boost in the last few days following the sanctions announcement, but in general, freight rates are pretty low. So they have quite a bit of room to rise. In general, I would see tariffs as putting a bit of upward pressure on tanker rates.
Makes sense. Okay, and do you think that what's going on around the West Coast would also spill into the US Gulf Coast in terms of Aframax freight?
It might a little bit. I mean, separate basins, but the tanker market is a global one. So if you have a bit of tightness in in one basin, then that starts to influence the supply in other basins as ships shift from one region to another.
And speaking of Gulf of Mexico, as it is called these days, that's another question that we have here. The tariffs are also promised for Mexico with the same number of 25%, and obviously the dynamics here are a little different than it is for Canada. So, Bruce, can you maybe shed some light on what the impact may be from tariffs on Mexico, where in terms of the crude flows, in terms of maybe prices for US refiners and how much it's going to impact them, and where maybe the flows are going to shift if the tariffs were to happen?
Sure, it's kind of fun being down here in Texas because quite honestly, we're kind of in the epicenter of this. So starting with the Gulf of Mexico system, of course, we have a lot of refining capacity down here in Texas, Louisiana, but we're going to hit two ways. One, crude does make its way from Canada down to the U.S. Gulf Coast, but also we pull a lot of crude in from Mexico. So the first thing you're going to see is that displacement of Mexican crude coming off. It could be somewhere between 300,000 to 500,000 barrels a day offline. It's gone. The nice thing that's different, though, versus the Gulf of Mexico versus PADD 2 that's in the center of the United States as well, we have pipeline connectivity and waterborne. So you can bring crudes in from the other areas around the world pretty quickly. So Mexican crude can just get pushed to another part of the world. That's fine. Let it go to Asia. Let it go wherever it may be. We'll probably take crudes in from the Middle East. We historically have taken crudes like that in the past. So we could take some sours that come in that area to offset some of the price. We do produce some sour crude in the US, but the heavy crude is what's going to be kind of missed the most. We have on and off, depending on sanctions, could get it from Venezuela. Maybe yes, maybe no. We could get it from places like Brazil and Colombia. So there are options for the Gulf of Mexico just to pull heavy crude in from other locations. So you're going to just see a little bit of dynamic crude flow change if this impact does come through. Very quickly. The other thing is Mexico. Well, it's over here on the Atlantic side of the ocean where we're sitting at that particular crude. So that crude is going to make its way most likely into the Asian or European market. It could just go that way, go east. It's a little bit different dynamic than when you're looking at the Pacific Ocean on the West Coast, where Jeff was alluding to. We're going to be short crude there. It's a waterborne market, so that's going to have to get backfilled most likely with South American crudes like Oriente Napo crude out of Ecuador, for example, will probably come back into those mixed. ANS crude, it was on the fringe of being exported into the Asian market. That's probably going to pull its way back into the California market. So a lot of flows that are happening. And we're definitely going to see a little bit pressure on the sweet and sour spread for sure in the Gulf of Mexico. So if we're going to be a little tight on the sour side of it, well, it's probably going to influence that light, heavy spread, sweet, sour spread.
Makes sense. And Nick, coming back to you here, quite a few changes just listening to what Bruce had to say in terms of where the crude flows are going to go, especially if we're talking about long-haul VLCC voyages, say from the Middle East, bringing Iraqi crudes to either US Gulf Coast to US West Coast, and of course the shift in where different American producers send their stuff. What do you think how that is going to impact the freight rates? Which types of vessels are going to be more expensive, and how it's going to affect the cost of moving crude overall for Americas?
Sure. Same dynamic here in that if you have tariffs, the market gets less efficient, and what you're doing is you're getting rid of short haul voyages and replacing them with long haul voyages. So if you have more Mexican crude exports to Europe and to Asia, then those are relative, at least to shipments to the U.S. Gulf Coast. Those would be very long haul voyages that keeps the tanker occupied for longer and starts to tighten the market a little bit. There's also the issue of potential retaliatory tariffs on U.S. shipments to Mexico. So Mexico is the largest buyer of U.S. gasoline and diesel. That would also, this is all hypothetical. Everything we're talking about right now is hypothetical. But if that did happen, then that would be a pretty significant disruption to the clean tanker market and add ton miles into that market as well. Tankers, it's a global market, so all of this puts a little bit of upward pressure on rates.
Hmm. And since we're talking global market, Europe, also a known place in the world, how is that Europe in particular may be affected by this, James? Are we going to see some changes in flows here, or would the tariffs specifically on Mexico and Canada, and with all the changes in flows that the guys talk about, not have much of the impact of what Europe consumes? Could you shed more light on that?
Good questions. I mean, Europe has come to rely quite heavily on crude from the United States. It's not sending much crude to the United States at the moment, but any change in the flows out of the Americas could be to the benefit of Europe. We've learnt to rely on America's crude more and more since the lifting of the export ban, of course, back in the end of 2015, but much more and more since the Ukraine-Russia conflict began, of course, with Russian crude, the mainstay of Europe, being diverted due to embargoes to the Asian market. There was a huge gap in Europe for crude, particularly of medium sour type. And just looking at the latest flows into Europe just from the US, regardless of the rest of the Americas, there's more than 2 million barrels a day of US crude being delivered into Europe this month, and that is close to a record, but not the record. It was even higher than that at certain times last year. So speaking about Trump and tariffs, Trump did make a comment back in December, which, you know, like every month seems like a lifetime ago, but back in December he said something like, Europe needs to buy more US oil and gas or face big time tariffs. I don't know if they were exact words, but it was words to that effect. Now, of course, you know, we're recording this on the 14th. There have been some noises from the incoming administration that tariffs may be introduced gradually and to avoid any kind of big disruptions. And as Nick said, everything we're discussing here is hypothetical. But, Europe is not united at the moment. Frankly speaking, we have governments collapsing, particularly in France and Germany, the kind of mainstays of the European Union. We have the UK, of course, is out of the European Union now. And, aside from the tariff issue, if pressure comes from an incoming Trump administration to change, let's say, our relationship with Russia, there may be some parts of Europe that are more inclined to do that more quickly than others. And so an already rather fractured bloc may find itself under pressure from both sides, if you like. So we'll see. There are some that expect we'll see more Russian oil being refined in Europe by the end of 2025. That's highly speculative. At the moment, it can't happen, but the appetite is here in Europe for medium sour crude. And so whether embargoes are lifted and sanctions relaxed in the short term, it doesn't look like it, but there is a ready market for that crude in certainly parts of Europe. But given that the flows have changed so radically, I think we can expect more crude certainly from Latin America and from the US to continue to satisfy European demand.
Makes sense. Okay, and in terms of winners and losers here, if we sum up from what we talked here, if those tariffs either, even if they're eased in, or they just straight up 25%, and if they are going to happen at all, of course, and they do come into play, who do you think, guys, would be the main winners here in terms of, for instance, gaining market share, whether it would be in the US, whether it would be in Europe or in Latin, and who might be suffering more than others? Maybe starting with you, Jeff.
I can't tell you a winner. I can tell you two big losers. One is the American consumer, who could see $6 plus gasoline prices, particularly mid-continent California. But secondly, the Canadian producer, who will be leaned on by the refiners to lower their prices a bit. And you have to remember that the Canadian barrels of crude oil that are produced in Western Canada and go to Quebec in Eastern Canada, they travel through the United States. And it's anybody's guess about whether that throughput is going to work under this new world.
Yeah. And you guys agree? Any winners at all? Or it's just going to hit everyone the same.
I mean, there's a possibility when you displace heavy crude from Mexico and Canada, someone's going to backfill that, right?
Hmm.
So where that's probably going to come is straight out of the Middle East. So,
Hmm.
companies, whether Soma, Iraq, or the Saudis with Aramco, they're going to seize this opportunity and come in quick. And they know because, Aramco, for example, has a refinery here in the U.S. Gulf Coast. They're going to come straight in for that. But on the same flip side, Pemex, which is a Mexican refinery, has a refinery here too. Their crude's going to be cut. Someone's going to have to figure out how to make that relationship now work. So you better believe it's going to come in most likely from the Middle East. Maybe a little bit more South American can take it away from Europe. So, hey, that's fine. We'll take that crude over here as well. So there is some opportunity for some people to come in, try to take longer term market contracts or take firm positions in it. If these tariffs stay, those are the people that are going to take advantage of it.
I think as well that one thing we can be sure is that tariffs beget more tariffs, right? There may be retaliatory measures from China. I mean, we in the last Trump administration we saw a kind of trade war with China. Certainly, European lawmakers would be quick to take advantage of that if they could, get cheap goods instead of them being sent to the United States. And as Nick was saying before, any kind of measure like this increases inefficiency in the system, which may benefit some if there are higher freight rates and if there are higher prices for certain kinds of crude. But as Jeff was saying, consumers are usually bear the brunt of these kind of
Paying
measures.
the price.
From I think like the ship owner perspective, short, medium term, it might be beneficial as you see these longer haul routes. They like the long haul cargoes. Now, if you get into a wider trade war and you start to see global trade start to slow, that starts to remove some cargoes and could, in the longer term, put some downward pressure on the market. So you might have a little bit of a sugar high from a shipping perspective early, and that could wear off depending how this develops.
Well, there's also, when it comes to shipping, there's also the question of how much fleet is gonna go into it, and here we look both at what's gonna happen with the sanctioned fleet and what is going to do where the sanctions are further tightened as they are now, or if they're released by Trump and the administration further, and the new deliveries. But that is a whole topic in itself, which we're probably going to address in the other podcast. For this one, we're running out of time already. So I just want to thank everyone for joining and sharing your amazing expertise on this and educated opinions on where these things might go. And to everyone listening, if you are a subscriber of either Argus Crude or Argus Tanker Freight, you will be able to download a limited edition file with a lovely map from the link in the podcast. And thank you very much for listening, and we'll see you on the next one.